Last week, Stephen and I did an interview right here in Stephen's store, but there were just pieces of the interview that we forgot to record. We didn't record them. So I wanted to come back and make sure we got a chance to actually do those pieces.
Cool.
So what you're going to notice is that in about 2 seconds, we're going to go into the normal episode of Unplanned, but I just wanted to give this little intro to get us started. Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host. Remember to hit the subscribe button for plenty more interesting conversations to come. Today on Unplanned, we're in a store that's local to me where I am here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we're here with somebody who knows everything about the MBTA, which is the local transit system here in Boston. And he also has a plethora, and I know that's a fancy word, of stuff that we're going to look at during the course of this conversation. And that person is Stephen Beaucher.
Hi, Sam.
And he is the proprietor of WardMaps here on Massachusetts Avenue here in Cambridge. Stephen, welcome to Unplanned.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Stephen, so let's, we got a lot to talk about. We actually got a lot to talk about. Why don't you start by telling us where we're sitting right now?
Sure.
Where are we?
So we're in my shop, WardMaps, on Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge. We're between Porter and Harvard Square. This is our mutual neighborhood as well. This is a retail store that outgrew, this is an outgrowth of an antique map collection that got out of hand. And my wife and I, my brother, used to collect antique maps, and we started this business. That's 2004, so 15 some odd years ago. So now I sell antique maps. I also run the MBTA's merchandise program out of this shop. So if you come in, it's all things map related, city related, urban related, as well as public transit related.
All right, so so there's so much in there. Why don't we start with the antique maps? So was this just a fascination with all maps that are antique, and how do you define antique? What's an antique map?
Sure. So yeah, I use the word antique as opposed to antiquarian because our collection focuses on 19th and early 20th century. And in the realm of antiquarian maps, that's new. Those are the young kids on the block. But as a younger map dealer, that's where I was able to carve out my collection. But our collection really started with cities, city maps, real estate maps, cadastral maps, things that show cities and urban planning on a local level.
All right, so that's where we're sitting right now. I also mentioned the MBTA, and it seems to me at any rate, so from a sort of arm's length, you have a fascination with the MBTA, with transit systems in general, maybe with Boston specifically. What's that all about?
So I grew up in the Merrimack Valley in the suburbs, and my first introduction to the city, urbanity, Boston, was as a junior high schooler coming in on the commuter rail. So that was how I first met the city. But I've always had a lifelong love of trains, rail transportation. Tie that in to being a practicing architect studying urban geography and history. It really just the transit systems, which are the core of so many cities, I have a distinct love for that. But now I've attacked it academically in writing a book about the subject.
All right. Well, we're going to get to your book in just a second. Before that, you said you were something for the MBTA. Their excess material. I can't remember. You used some.
So we operate what's called MBTA Gifts. It's essentially the gift program for the MBTA. And we do sell and salvage old signs, but like the mask you're wearing, we do develop and bring to market new products that are licensed. And so it's sort of what other cities in the country do: New York, Chicago, San Francisco, DC. We bring licensed products to market that celebrate transit history and all things T.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, well, the reason we're here today, not that all this stuff isn't fascinating, is because, as you just alluded to, you have completed relatively recently this incredible tome, this book, which I would call encyclopedic. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's called Boston in Transit, Mapping the History of Public Transportation in the Hub. And this is it. What prompted you to write this book?
So as my shop grew and my business grew, and I started to bring in transit artifacts, schedules, ephemera, actual signs from the T, I needed to teach myself what these things were. And I had began assembling a library of disparate sources. So lots of books, lots of articles. There's so much rich history, there's so many places to look, but there was never one book, one volume where I could say, that's going to give me the answer when this station opened, or when the first train hit the tracks on the Boston and Worcester Railroad. So my goal was to sort of wade into the very deep pool of transit history in Boston and create a soup to nuts from 1630 to 2019. I call it a summary history. You could write books just on types of trolleys, and those books are out there. I want to tell the whole story, all about the buses, the trolleys, the streetcars, everything from 1630 to today.
Well, so that was a question that I had as I began to look through this book. Does it include everything? Buses, trolleys, boats, ferry boats, etc.?
Yep.
And the answer to that is yes,
yeah.
it does.
And I like I say in the kind of introduction and the preface, I introduce you to everything. And there are wonderful books written just on the Boston and Maine Railroad. But I introduce you to the trains, the operators. I introduce you to all the different modes, the ones that we've had over time, from horses through electrification, through steam railroading, through dieselification, through public transit. I mean, it all started, none of it was owned by the public. It was all private enterprise. So I introduce you to a lot, and I like to say the book is a gateway to digging deeper, and there's so many resources out there. A lot of them are actually things that I sell in the shop.
Absolutely fascinating. All right, so now I want to put you on the spot, because as we mentioned in the beginning of the show, Unplanned is a show about cities and how they work. Why don't you pick out a couple of your favorite stories that you feel really tell the story of the T of transportation in Boston in any facet that you find particularly interesting? Why don't you take us into one or two or three of those?
Okay.
What's the first one you'd start with?
So first one I'd start with, I think it's really interesting, is right around the turn of the last turn of the century, when the L opens up. Can I read something from the book? Actually?
Absolutely, please. Do it.
Because I flagged this.
No, yeah.
The elevated opened on June 10th, 1901, the day after the commencement of service. The Boston Post lambasted the Boston Elevated Railway Company. They're the operator of it. There was a seemingly utter inability to handle the vast crowd that wanted to ride, and there was certainly inability to run trains regularly or to make anything like scheduled time. Now, within the Tremont Street subway, this is at a time when a rapid transit car, imagine the Orange Line running through Park Street Station, and trolleys as well. Within the Tremont Street subway, the overcrowding became dangerous. The June 11th, 1901 Boston Post recorded, between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the mass of humanity whirled and swayed back and forth. It resembled in many respects an incipient riot. Guards and station men were pushed aside. It was a football game, mass play with hundreds of players on each side.
As you were reading that, as you were talking about that, it reminded me that Boston is the first city, I believe, you correct me,
Yep.
in North America to have an actual subway, an underground train. Is that correct?
So we have what is precisely called the first public transit subway in North America. So that's the first subway in which public transit vehicles rode through. That's the Tremont Street subway that opened September of 1897. Between Boylston Street Station and Park Street Station. Those were the only two stations that you could ride between at the time underground. And then in 1898, the rest of the Tremont Street subway opened completely, and you could take a streetcar from the Haymarket Incline at Causeway Street and take that through beneath Tremont Street, and then you could either come out at Pleasant Street, which is kind of where the theater district is today, or you'd actually pop out on your trolley in the public garden.
Oh, interesting.
Yep.
But before that, and to correct this if this is wrong, it was elevated, or was that the first investment in the sort of?
It was the first. It was built by the city of Boston,
right.
But it was our first significant municipal investment in public transit infrastructure. Prior to that, the majority of the tracks, the vehicles, the wires, everything had been private enterprise. It had oversight, but it did not have a direct funding mechanism from public entities.
Which map are we going to look at?
There's a wonderful map right behind us. This is a J.H. Colton map of the city of Boston. This is I'm trying to read the date there, right around 1857 or so. This shows Boston right in the middle of the period that my book covers. And it shows the city in the middle. That's the Shawmut Peninsula. That's the original place where the English colonists landed and renamed that portion, the Shawmut Peninsula. They renamed that Boston. But what this shows is 19th century Boston, middle of the 19th century. All these black, slender lines are coming in from the mainland all around the city. Those are the rail lines, the bridges, the connections that I talk about in the book. That even what, this is 220 years or so after the settlement of the city, the establishment of the city, it's still surrounded by water. Really, Boston Neck down below has been thickened up, but Boston was an island when it was settled. So all these transit connections, the first one was a ferry. They've always been vital to the development and the function of the city. They didn't just show up later to promote suburban development. The city could not have been established without these early connections.
How were those first crossings done? How did that work in terms of getting across the river there?
Yep. So the first crossing is going to be due north from Charlestown to Boston. The English colonists had established themselves at Charlestown, then they quickly jumped over. But some of them stayed in Charlestown. So that first connection was a ferry. And it was as simple as a little boat that you could get a couple people in. But by the end of the year that they established Boston, the colonial government said, we need a publicly operated ferry. We need someone that we're going to license, and they're going to charge a set rate. So that was Boston's first mode of public transportation. That ferry became...
Let's just pause on that for a second. That boat going across that neck of water there was the first public transportation, called for by the colonial governor in 1630 something.
Yep. So they come over, they set up Boston, they name it in September 1630. By November, they had put out the advertisement for somebody to operate a ferry to Charlestown. The precise date of the first operation of it is blurry, but by the following year, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he's named and he's running it back and forth.
The other thing I can't help but notice is over your shoulder here is the Highland Branch. Ride your scenic Highland Branch. What is this thing? This is probably a good example of the kind of thing you'll find in WardMaps here on Massachusetts Avenue. What the heck? First of all, it says MTA, which is before the MBTA, which is what it's called today. What are we looking at here? What is this thing?
So this is the kind of thing that I've always collected, that we deal in the store, pieces of ephemera, transit artifacts. So it's not a vehicle, it's not a piece of a vehicle, it's the stuff that advertised how you would use the vehicles to get around. So this is the Highland Branch, which is now the Riverside line. So the MTA, which is the predecessor to the MBTA, the MTA ran things in Boston from 1947 to 1964, and they produced this wonderful series of advertisements. They were so excited that they took a former train line run by the Boston and Albany Railroad and converted it to streetcar service. And they used these beautiful PCC cars. And in their ads, they have brochures that get into this as well. This woman, she travels and comes out, the quotes say in here, refreshed. And she had such a wonderful ride commuting from Waban or Newton and coming into the city on these beautiful these beautiful PCC cars. So this was transit marketing, which we really don't see anymore. We're just trying to keep things running now. But this was saying, hey, it's new. It's going to bring you to the city, and it's wonderful.
All right, folks, so we're back, and as you can tell, it's a different day, and I'm here with Stephen Beaucher, and part of the thing that we didn't talk about last week, but I wanted to hear about, was this map that you're going to tell us all about. This map is actually your creation, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. So why don't you just tell us, what are we looking at?
Sure. Yeah, so what I wanted to do with Boston in Transit, the book, was tell the story in narrative form and pictorial form, lots of images, lots of maps throughout the book. But I also wanted a cheat sheet, a single map that told the history of all of the MBTA's colored lines. Not all the lines that ever existed, because that would be a lot of maps. So this covers the orange, the blue, the red, silver, green lines, and their routes. And I worked closely actually with the cartographer who is the current custodian of the MBTA maps. He worked with me. I did all the research for the dates. He helped me out with the graphics on this. So it's really a joint production, but it's the Boston in Transit map, the history of the MBTA's colored lines. And every line I've labeled what each segment as it was built, what it was originally called. So the red line consisted of the Cambridge subway, the new West Boston Bridge, etc. All the dates are on there of when each segment opened. I also go through each station and I list its names over time, when the station opened, when it was renamed, when the station may have been closed if it was closed. An interesting example is Heinz Convention Center, which in the T's tenure has had more station names than any other MBTA station, opening as Massachusetts in 1914, and most recently being named Heinz Convention Center. And there's in my book, there's a couple page spreads that I just devote to that station. I consider it almost like a palace to regional public transit. It's almost as grand as a train station in a medium-sized European city.
And yeah, I mean, fascinating, because if you go there today, there's, from my definition of it, there's kind of nothing there. I mean, there's trains and cars moving through there, but basically otherwise it's just parking lots. So what happened? I mean, what was the modern iteration? What was the modern thought process there?
Yeah, so, referring to the map, here's Sullivan Square, the old Sullivan Square station. That was on the old L. And then when the T builds the Haymarket North extension, which goes up into Malden, the orange line is rerouted essentially into a tunnel and a trench, and this is no longer needed. Sullivan Square was at the time, it was 75 years old, the terminal. It really hadn't been maintained. It was outdated. It really couldn't be served by a modern rapid transit system. But it wasn't even preserved as, say, down in Nubian Square, where we kept some piece of the history.
What is the story behind the original version of this map and its history?
Sure. So my Boston in Transit map builds upon what was created in 1964, 65, 66 by Cambridge 7 architects. Right here in Cambridge, they're still around. They were a multidisciplinary design firm at the time. So they had graphic designers, architects, and they were hired by the brand new MBTA to redesign everything aesthetic for the MBTA. Stations, signs, graphics. That's where we get Helvetica on the signs. One of the fruits of their work was the spider map. We called it that because Boston's a radial transit system. All the lines kind of feed into the center and come back out. Loosely looks like a spider web. And the colors were work they designed and brought them, they decided upon them in consultation with the T. Are you familiar with what the colors are?
No, I mean, I'd be fascinated to learn. Tell us.
So green line served the western streetcar suburbs. That was assigned green.
And then these would be the western streetcar suburbs out here, right?
Yeah, exactly. The red line, the Cambridge subway was the first portion of that line to open. It served Harvard, so they opted for a near Harvard crimson for that. The blue line, which serves all the seaside communities in Revere and East Boston, that was signed blue, and also because it goes under the harbor. The orange line is interesting because that follows, it's a little more esoteric. There was a street originally entering Boston, it's now Washington Street in the South End, that was called Orange Street. And after President Washington and we won the American Revolution, after President Washington came up Orange Street, they renamed it Washington Street. But the orange line kind of pays homage back to that. And we did those. And
the silver line is...
Silver line. I don't have a solid answer for that other than I think they ran out of colors. Because yellow was for the bus and purple, the sign of royalty in travel, that was signed to the commuter rail.
Interesting. I wonder if current day commuters would view that as the royal version of travel.
I think that's debatable.
Well, Stephen, you spent a lot of time with us talking about your book. Tell us, first of all, where are we now? Where is WardMaps? And then also, where can people get your book? But where's WardMaps?
Absolutely. So yeah, this is my shop, WardMaps. We're at 1735 Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge. We're a little closer to the Porter Square T-stop. And you can get my book, Boston in Transit. You can also buy prints of the map. I'm also making available reproductions, fine art prints of all the photographs and maps that are featured in the book. So the book, the map, and the images all can be purchased on bostonintransit.com. Of course, it's also on my other websites, wardmaps.com and mbtagifts.com.
Well, Stephen, you've been a real hero to spend some time with us on Unplanned, and I just want to thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure, Sam. Thank you.